The government is reducing the number of units available in the emissions trading scheme, which the Climate Change Minister says will help to restore confidence in the ETS while also reducing emissions. Economist Eric Crampton from the New Zealand Initiative keenly studies the ETS and is with us now. Kia ora, good morning.
Good morning.
Let's start with a bit of historical context here. How would you assess the effectiveness of the ETS up to this point?
It's been improving strongly. So James Shaw put a binding cap onto the ETS, which really mattered. Prior to that, our ETS worked a little bit more like a carbon tax. So you can really distinguish two ways of putting a price on carbon. One, you put a tax on it, where every ton of emissions you put up draws a tax. The other way is a cap and trade scheme, where you have to surrender a permit for releasing a ton of carbon into the atmosphere. We've gone with a cap and trade scheme. Until Shaw made those adjustments, it acted more like a carbon tax because the government would just sell however many units people wanted to buy at $20.
Right.
That became capped, but at a fairly high level. The cap started reducing in volume, but only slowly. And the prior government, in the lead up to the election, got a bit of cold feet around some of the Climate Change Commission's recommendations about reducing the cap more quickly. That introduced a bit of uncertainty, so people didn't quite know what to expect going forward. How many units would be coming up for auction, and that, of course, helps affect the price.
Yeah.
The minister has gone with the Climate Change Commission's recommendations. They're pretty close to it. Fairly tight reductions in the cap. It's about a halving of the number of units that will be coming up for auction. That will affect the prices going forward.
Yeah, talk to us a little bit more about that. What will be the impact of Simon Watt's announcement this week?
Well, first, people are going to be expecting a lot fewer units to be coming to market. Last year, a lot of the auctions just failed to clear because not enough bids came in that met the government's confidential reserve price, so they didn't auction any units. People instead were using old units that they'd stockpiled or units that are generated when people grow trees.
Right.
So those were the ones that were being used. The government didn't make any money at the carbon auctions last year. Sharply reducing the number of units available should mean that markets will be more likely to clear, at least from 2025. We'll see how that goes. It is still bound, though, by the ability to grow trees and generate credits that way. So long as it's fairly cheap to grow trees and sequester carbon that way, then carbon prices can't be too much ahead of the cost of turning kind of low-grade paddocks into carbon forests. And that's a feature rather than a bug. Some people worry that that reduces the incentive to mitigate emissions, but we have a net zero emissions target for 2050.
Not a gross zero.
Not a gross zero target.
Yeah.
So if a set of trees suck a ton of carbon out of the atmosphere, that's as good as a ton not going up there in the first place.
Under our system.
Under our system. And really, from the atmosphere's perspective, so long as you're really good on the accounting and you make sure that if the forest burns down, you're requiring that the carbon come out another way.
So to consider what the changes that the Climate Change Minister announced this week will mean for consumers, you're saying that scarcity will mean an increase in the carbon price when it comes to the ETS, but because the cost of offsetting emissions is still relatively low through things like forestation, actually we might not see a huge impact in terms of consumer prices at the moment.
Yeah. So we've already seen some impact. So the carbon price went up by about $5 a ton on the minister's announcement, signaling that people are expecting this to have some effect. So the carbon price went from about $55 to about $60. So just in ways of thinking about that and what it means, when you're filling up your car, every $10 of carbon price increase is about $1 worth on a 40-liter tank.
Right.
So at the current carbon price of $60, about $6 when you buy a tank of fuel. That's paying for the emissions permit that the fuel company bought on your behalf.
Right.
So you don't know it, but the petrol company already bought emissions permits for you. It surrenders them when it distributes the fuel, and that means that somebody else can't use those permits and emit somewhere else in the economy.
We were speaking with the Energy Minister earlier on, talking about the potential for LNG imports in New Zealand. Of course, as you said, we have a fixed cap or a sinking cap in the ETS. So if New Zealand is to burn more gas or use more thermal sources of electricity generation in the future, how is that likely to affect the carbon price?
Oh, it would push up the carbon price because if there's more... In a good year, we're relying on hydroelectric in combination with solar and wind and geothermal 20% is wonderful. We could do a lot more with geothermal. In a good year, carbon prices aren't really hitting into electricity prices.
Right.
In a dry year, we're going to be relying a lot more on thermal. Coal is especially costly that way, gas a little bit less so. That feeds through into power prices, but it also pushes up the price of carbon because we've got one more significant user of carbon credits.
The new government has announced that agricultural emissions will be kept out of the ETS for at least or for up to another 5 years compared to the previous backstop. So the backstop shifted from 2025 to 2030. What do you make of that decision? What does it mean for the ETS?
It's not ideal, but it's probably the best we can make of it from where we are. So just for a bit of past history, agricultural emissions are more difficult than others. Biogenic methane has a different target from carbon dioxide. You could deal with it through its own market. And the zero carbon legislation had a backstop that agricultural emissions would come into the ETS, just treating methane as a carbon dioxide equivalent from 2025 onwards. And that was meant to encourage sharp negotiation and for people to take it seriously. Agriculture sector and the government worked pretty hard towards that in He Waka Eke Noa. Unfortunately, that went wrong. Sort of at the last minute, the government changed some of what was on offer. Farmers felt betrayed by it, and the whole thing fell over. So now they're trying to build that back up with a 2030 pricing regime to come in. We'll see how that all pans out, but maintaining that certainty or reestablishing certainty will matter because nobody will take serious efforts with sort of expensive investments unless they're pretty sure that they're going to be facing a price if they don't do it, right?
And I mean, that methane equivalent is an important point, but there are other gases that are emitted through agricultural processes, right? Like nitrous oxide, for example, could potentially be brought in earlier.
It sure could. So agricultural emissions through nitrogen fertilizers. So there's a bit of off-gassing from nitrogen fertilizers. That could be brought into the ETS as a CO2 equivalent. Now, one tricky bit in it is that most agricultural nitrous oxide emissions aren't really just from the fertilizer. It's cows that pee in a concentrated spot on the paddock.
Yeah.
So trying to find ways of mitigating that is important. And somewhat perversely, it looks like fertilizer winds up being more important in cropping than in top dressing in paddocks.
You talked about the forestation and offsetting, and obviously as the carbon price increased, there will be impacts that perhaps we can't necessarily anticipate or we haven't fully appreciated at this point. So as people respond to the changing carbon price in years to come, how should settings in the ETS be changed to reflect those concerns?
Well, economists have something that's called the Tinbergen rule. I won't get into it, but the simplest way of thinking about it is don't try to hit more than one bird with the same stone because you're going to fail in everything.
Right.
So the ETS has one big job that nothing else in government handles. That job is reducing net emissions and driving them down to zero by 2050. So keep the ETS focused on that one big job, recognizing every ton that's sequestered, whether it's through a tree or through CCUS, so carbon capture storage solutions. So if you are burning, say, coal at a power plant, if you're able to sequester that gas in, say, old LPG fields so that it can't come out, well, that's a way of avoiding the emissions in the first place, right?
Yeah.
There's also other tech that's coming up. A friend at Canterbury University had been working on this. I used to be based there. They're trying to sequester it in olivine rock. And that has an awful lot of potential. We have no clue which of these is going to pan out, but you want to have an ETS that's flexible enough to handle any of these that can come up. Every one of these, though, might have downstream consequences that people get annoyed by. So in a lot of farming communities, there's worry about the rate of afforestation. Councils can be worried about the effects on roads if there's eventual production logging out of those. All of those downstream consequences really should have their own targeted measures addressing them specifically rather than change the incentives in the ETS to sequester carbon.
So in some senses, the biggest threat to the effectiveness of the ETS is political tinkering with the ETS. Sure, have a policy response to some of those concerns, but keep it outside of the ETS.
That's right. That's right.
Very good. Thank you so much for your time, Eric. We
no
really
problem
appreciate
at all.
it. Eric Crampton from the New Zealand Initiative.